We're going straight in, without the usual music, without the usual little audio tease that I do. It just wouldn't feel right, because today, the 14th of June, 2024, when this episode 18 of If I Rule the World is released, marks 7 years since the Grenfell fire in West London, where 127 homes were destroyed and 72 lives were lost, in a fire that many residents had been warning would happen from as early as 2012. One of those residents whose voice was ignored and worse, as you'll hear, because he's today's guest, is Ed Daffarn, who happens to be a keen birder, and under different circumstances I'd be chatting with Ed about birding and wildlife and nature. But Ed was one of the people trying to raise the alarm with the council and the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, the TMO. Ed is also the man behind the Grenfell Action Group blog that captures, and you can still read it, it's online, what can only be described as systemic and institutional disdain for the residents of Grenfell Tower. The list of failings include faulty fire doors, defunct fire extinguishers, faulty sprinklers, no central fire alarm, and a stay-put protocol for the residents to stay in their flats rather than evacuate the building during a fire. The protocol was working on the premise that the building's original design would contain any fire. All that changed when the building underwent a makeover in the 2010s, and amongst other things, the tower was wrapped in the now infamous ACM cladding, which even then was known to pose a serious fire risk. At the heart of this, though, is a tale of two cities, a concrete block of social housing that towered above the affluent West London borough of Kensington and Chelsea. Grenfell has become a lens to 21st century social inequality of class and race in one of the richest countries in the world. I woke up to the news of the Grenfell fire while I was on the job for BBC Springwatch. We were presenting from Sherborne Park Estate in Dorset, which is frankly worlds apart from the scenes I was seeing unfolding on all the screens that are dotted around the OB site, the outside broadcast site. And it was a little bit like 9/11. I remember exactly where I was, what I was doing, but unlike 9/11, I would hazard or put a cautious bet on the fact that this is not true for everyone, because in my view, I think Grenfell has impacted different people differently, and sadly, I think for some people, hardly or not at all. All that said, though, in a small fishing village in a far corner of Cornwall, people there knew what it was like to lose so many lives overnight from a tight-knit community, having suffered a collective trauma of their own. In 1981, the Penley lifeboat disaster, where this small community lost 8 of their men, volunteer lifeboat men, in a single call-out. The response was to set up a charity, Cornwall Hugs Grenfell, which offers, and still offers to this day, respite breaks and support for the Grenfell survivors and the bereaved. So I think of this as like a little pinprick of light in an otherwise very bleak story of inequality and injustice. And it was really through this charity that I got to meet in 2019 the Grenfell United campaigners, including Ed. I took a group of their children rock pooling, and there was an evening I spent. It was a closed-door event, and I was really privileged and honoured to be invited to attend. And really I saw the rawness and the grieving, weary hearts that were also starting to become system change experts. So I was really nervous about this interview. I was mindful that getting Ed on the podcast would take him back to a day that he and so many wish had never happened. But to this day, and despite overwhelming evidence, there are still zero arrests, let alone criminal prosecutions. And it is for this reason, because justice has not been served, that Ed has agreed to come on and talk once again about what he describes as a tragedy in 3 acts.
I always kind of look at Grenfell as a tragedy in 3 acts, basically. First act is the way that we were treated as a community prior to the fires. Myself and a guy called Francis O'Connor were involved with writing a blog called the Grenfell Action Group blog. We were trying to highlight some of the failings of health and safety by our landlord, the Kensington and Chelsea Tenant Management Organisation, the lack of scrutiny of the TMO by our council, the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, vilified, and for our pains we were scapegoated and ridiculed. And for a long, long time prior to the fire, that was a deeply humiliating process. We were trying to point out legitimate concerns, and instead of having our concerns listened to, we were labeled rebels. On a personal level, I was accused of being violent, disruptive, impossible to work with, unreasonable. And I don't consider myself any of those things. I was passionate, and we had legitimate concerns. So Act One is very much that sort of like ill treatment of residents prior to the fire. Act Two is the night of the fire, and just like this absolute intense violence that was inflicted on our community. Like, just to see the tower burning and the violence of that, it was a violence that took 72 lives in the end, was just so traumatic, not only for us in the building, not only for the people living on Lancaster West Estate and the surrounding estates, but for the whole of the North Kensington community. It was just absolutely, I can't even begin to explain how traumatic it was. And then the third part of it was the aftermath, which in the very first stages involved us literally being abandoned on the streets. So in the fifth, sixth richest country of the world in the 21st century, in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, no one came to help us. The state, the local authority left us, and it was the community that came, opened up local churches, opened up local mosques, opened up local community centres, and took us in. There's no in which of these, acts was the worst, but sometimes when I think of it, almost that kind of abandonment after the violence and after the disrespect is sometimes the hardest to comprehend and to get my head around. But the night itself was, we were having the most beautiful summer weather. It was really hot, really sultry, beautiful day in London. It was in the middle of Ramadan, and it was just great being in the community. And then, I went to bed at about 1:45, and about 1 o'clock, I heard my neighbour's smoke alarm. I heard a ping, ping, ping coming from my neighbour's flat. And I was in bed, and I didn't even get out of bed. I just thought my neighbour's probably burnt some toast, or, there's nothing to be concerned about here. And then about 10 minutes later, at about 1:10, 1:15, I heard some commotion coming out from the communal hallway. Now, I lived on the 13th floor, which then turned into the 16th floor. That time of night, it was not usual to hear any sort of commotion outside my front door. And that did actually get me out of bed. So I threw on some shorts, a t-shirt, went to my front door, opened my front door, expecting to see my neighbour, I'm very sorry, I burnt some toast or whatever. But instead of that, as I opened my front door, this kind of like absolutely acrid, swirling, dark smoke just came flooding into my flat. And I literally just opened the door a couple of inches. And like my heart, I slammed the door closed, and my heart just like absolutely sunk. I got this feeling of like complete and utter dread come over my body. And I'm like, God, this isn't my neighbour. This is something really, really serious. And then like my first thought at that time was, we'd been advised by our landlord to stay put. So my first thought was, look, I'm going to close the door. The fire isn't in my property. There's no need for me to leave. I'm going to call 999. And then at that moment, my telephone rang, and it was a neighbour of mine from downstairs, someone who'd already exited the building and was looking up at the building. And he shouted at me down the phone. He said, "Get out, and I can't use some of the language he used, but it was just like so strong and so forceful that I didn't argue with him. I just decided that I needed to leave my flat. I didn't say, look, there's a stay put policy. I've opened my door. There's a load of smoke. I think I should stay here. In that very instant, I decided to act. So I went to my bathroom and I wetted a towel in the sink. I put the wet towel around my mouth, around my face. I picked up my keys. I picked up my phone. I picked up my wallet, and I left my property. And I had to negotiate a 5-meter diagonal walk to where across the communal hallway to find the emergency exit and then the emergency stairs. But it was so smoky that I couldn't even see further than the end of my nose. And in fact, what happened to me is I tried to navigate my way to the emergency door, is that I hit the wall just to the left of the emergency door. And then rather than work out that I needed to move to find the emergency door, I started panicking and I started pouring at the wall, and I let go of my towel. And then when I let go of my towel, it meant that I started inhaling the smoke. And I literally was thinking to myself, this is it. I'm going to die. And then literally just at that moment, a firefighter had opened the emergency door and was crawling along the floor where in fact the smoke was less dense. And he literally bumped into my leg, grabbed hold of my leg, jumped up, grabbed hold of me, and then pulled me out from where I was into the emergency stairwell. And I mean, the firefighter wasn't there for me. He'd come up to rescue my next door neighbour after his son had begged him to come up to our landing to get his father. And of course, tragically, his father actually ended up passing away in the fire, as did another neighbour of mine on my landing. So, and then it took me some time to get myself together. And then this thing of vital flight took over me. And I just ran down the stairs out into outside the building, and then I got close to where the leisure centre was, where some other residents had already started gathering, and I turned around and looked up at the tower, and by that stage, which was about 25 to 2, pretty much the whole of the side of the building was on fire, and it was just terribly awful and traumatic. Well, yeah, and then the police came and started telling us to move back and shouting at us. And then we spent like hours just standing in the street, and we were told that some buses were going to come and pick us up, but no buses ever came. An ambulance worker leaned out of the ambulance and shouted at us to go home while we were watching our home burn. And yeah, it was really, so it was only around like 3:30, 4 o'clock in the morning that the community started opening up some of the spaces, and we were given some refuge in there. So yeah, so that was my experience of the evening, and I was one of the lucky ones, and I really mean that. I was extremely lucky to get out of the building.
Jeez, wow. 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 So you'd obviously been aware of the potential risks because you'd been trying to get the attention of local authorities or the people running the building, people in positions of power who ought to have been taking notice of all the things you're saying. When you got that call to get out, was that going through your mind, or was it more you just needed to get out? What, were you aware at that point of the risks and things that you had been trying to get people to take notice of?
In the immediate event, I didn't think that. And in fact, when I look back at it, I don't think I'd fully assessed the risk of me leaving my flat and going out into the danger of a smoke-filled hallway where I literally had to navigate in complete and utter darkness. The smoke was so full that you really couldn't see anything. And that's why so many people were unable to leave their flats, not because they obeyed a stay put process, but because it was just so dangerous to try and make that journey from your front door to the emergency stairwell. Had I done a proper risk assessment, I probably would have stayed where I was, and then the outcome of that would have been, that I quite possibly would never have got out of the building. I think it was in the days after when I became aware that the blog that we had written for the Grenfell Action Group in November 2016, which basically stated as a prediction, it wasn't, it's hard for me to explain. It was like, it was the natural consequence of having a landlord who doesn't adhere and scrutinize health and safety properly is that there's going to be a disaster, or the potential for a disaster, with the loss of life. And it's only at that point that the concerns that we were raising about that landlord would be listened to. And so I think it was only really in the days afterwards when that blog went viral, and I mean, when I say went viral, it went all around the world, that the kind of warnings that we'd been issuing Because you have to remember, Gillian, what happened was so traumatic. And it wasn't just like my own individual trauma. It was like we came out into a scene of like the whole of the area was like just everyone was traumatized. And there was no one there providing any support to us apart from ourselves. It took me a little bit of time to kind of process the fact that we had been warning about these issues. And of course, we had never been listened to. In fact, I was called a fantasist by our local deputy leader of the Royal Borough Council at Chelsea Council, Rob Fielding Mellon. He called me a fantasist, and I wasn't the fantasist. Under using freedom of information requests, we'd found evidence that there were fire extinguishers in our building with condemned written on their sides. There was no proper numbering for our floors, and they changed the numbering of our floors so that it was almost impossible for a firefighter to work out where they were in the building. There were multiple serious concerns about health and safety, none of which were listened to.
So you've hit upon a few of the system failures that, it combined led to this tragedy. The stay put order, just explain what that was about.
So stay put policy is enacted in many, and it certainly was enacted all over our landlord, the TMO's estate, which was if there is a fire in your building, so long as the fire isn't in your property, you stay in your property. And we'd had fires in Grenfell previously before the refurbishment where that had been an effective policy. In fact, it's quite funny because I'd actually called out that policy. I'm a social worker, and at work we used to do regular evacuation tests, and we'd leave the building, we'd assemble outside the front of the building. And I was really puzzled why we do that at work, but we didn't have that kind of protocol in position where we lived. And I wrote an email to the health and safety officer at the TMO saying, I'm concerned that stay put is a policy. And my concerns weren't so much about a fire, they were more about a kind of a gas explosion or some need to evacuate the building, in a hurry with a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And I think while Grenfell was a concrete building with supposedly proper fire doors and fire closers, that would possibly have been a policy that had some merit. But I think that, straight away, once they covered the building with literally this cladding that turned out to be liquid paraffin, accelerated by a chimney gap, and then the insulation that was stuck to the walls of the building, it was the worst advice that anyone could ever have been given. And of course, in fact, it wasn't stay put advice that kept people trapped in their homes. It was the fact that you couldn't leave your home because there was so much smoke in the hallways. And, all the 999 calls and all the recordings of those calls show people unable to leave their property, unable to make it to the stairwell because of the spread of smoke. And a lot of that was to do with the fact that the fire closers on people's front doors were either missing, broken, not functioning properly. And that was why the smoke spread so quickly inside the building.
So the before and after, in terms of the refurbishment of the building of Grenfell Tower, was that a critical moment in terms of the systems and the structure of the building, the integrity of the building changing so fundamentally? In terms of people who maybe have not been following this as closely as, frankly, maybe we should, help people understand what changed and therefore how it contributed to the, unnecessary loss of life.
So in its original construction, Grenfell Tower was what was known as like a brutalist building. It was pretty much solid concrete. And I can't say what would have happened if the fire had happened prior to the refurbishment, but we had fires prior to the refurbishment that had been contained in individual flats. But what happened is that the building was clad in this rain screen cladding, this ACM rain screen cladding, which really acted like liquid paraffin. And there was then a gap between that and some insulation that had been placed on the walls. And once it caught fire, from the fire started in a kitchen and got out of the window. And as soon as it got out of the window and the cladding caught on fire, it spread up the building, it spread around the crown of the building, the cladding melted, and then the melting, burning plastic traveled down the building. So the fire went up, across, down, around, back up again. And within an incredibly short time, our beautiful homes, our beautiful lives were turned completely upside down by this raging inferno. But the problem is deeper than just the cladding or the insulation, I mean, for me, the system failure really starts with the government and a policy of deregulation brought in by David Cameron, the eyes on UK PLC, i.e., let's make this country able to make money at the expense of health and safety. So there was if you bring a health and safety policy in or a regulation in, you need to get rid of two. That's how it started. And then it went, if you bring a regulation in, you need to get rid of three. That was how the policy worked. And in fact, we found during the public inquiry that the department that handled fire safety wasn't even aware that the regulations around fire safety did not apply to this kind of deregulatory regime. So we had a government that was like allowing construction companies, allowing manufacturers of cladding, of insulation to get products on buildings that probably weren't safe to have those products. One example is that Arconic, who are the manufacturers of the cladding system, are an American company based in Pittsburgh, and they're not able to sell their products over there. They're banned. ACM cladding is banned in America. So they went around the world looking for markets which were less restrictive, and they found that Grenfell Tower was, or England was a country, UK was a country that was less restrictive, and that's how the cladding ended up on Grenfell Tower. But not only were the government responsible for the kind of deregulation, they'd also had a series of 999 calls, previous fires and warnings, Roland Point, and much more recently in 2009, Lakanal House, where 6 people perished. They failed as a government to implement the recommendations from the coroner's report from Lakanal House. And had they implemented those recommendations, Grenfell may well not have happened.
So just to take it back a little bit, ACM cladding is banned in the US. Is it banned for this reason, that it is a fire risk?
It's banned because it acts like, as anyone who saw Grenfell will know, or anyone who saw the fire more recently in Valencia, or who's seen those terrible fires out in the Middle East, it is like liquid paraffin. It is not a product that should be anywhere near human lives on tall buildings. It's difficult to talk about the public inquiry because the report hasn't come out. But what the public inquiry demonstrated very clearly, or what was demonstrated very clearly in the evidence shown to the public inquiry, is that Arconic were fully aware of the dangers that their product posed, but still were happy to find a market for it. And, they had to find countries which had lax regulation, and they found that in the UK. And it's absolutely devastating. I mean, it's devastating that there are still, literally thousands of buildings in the UK with that same cladding on. And there are hundreds of thousands of buildings around the world with that cladding on. In fact, I heard the other day that cladding is still being manufactured in countries and sold in large quantities in Brazil, in countries like India. So I can quite clearly and comfortably predict that, we've said before, Grenfell 2 is in the post, but we've had Grenfell 2 because we've had a fire I think there was a fire in Milan, there was a fire in Valencia. Another absolutely catastrophic fire is going to happen. And, the warning should be out there because this product needs to be taken down from every high-rise building. Any building with ACM cladding, it needs to be removed. Otherwise, we will have another Grenfell Tower.
So let's move into what you're calling Act 3. Obviously, I'm trying to think, when I met you, that was 2019. So that was early days. But even then, what I really saw was a group of people who, in different ways, have been thrust into a position of being change makers, being system change makers. I mean, obviously you were already doing that before the fire, but I could see there were people who were having to get their heads around building regulations, how to navigate the halls of Westminster, how to deal with the media. There was all of a sudden, the people that came forward in the community were taking on this role in what you're calling Act 3. So just talk me through that.
So, yeah, I mean, we ended up in, well, I say we, I mean, bereaved survivors after the fire ended up in a number of community centres. One was the Clement St James Centre. I personally ended up in the rugby club, and these are all like well-known, very local to Grenfell Tower, like either educational projects or like youth clubs or churches. The Harrow Club was another one, another youth club that took people in. And yeah, we realized within literally a day or two that we needed to organize ourselves because no one was going to come and do that for us. And also in the immediate aftermath of the fire, many people were talking on our behalf, and we wanted to have our own voice. So literally within a day or two, and I mean literally within a day or two, we were passing around a notebook for people to write down their email address. If people still had their phones, they could write down their phone number. And we set up a WhatsApp group, and we just tried to ensure that we could keep the community together. And within a week or two, we'd formed Grenfell United, which was a group of bereaved survivors. In fact, the only way that you could become a member of Grenfell United was to be a bereaved family member or a resident of Grenfell Tower. And I think we went through 3 very clear kind of stages of what happened, of our immediate response to the fire. And the first one in the days and weeks after the fire was purely humanitarian, simply about trying to find ourselves some space and time to come to terms with what had happened, to gather around, gather each other, show each other some love and support in a very basic, just hugging people. And it sounds a bit funny now, but, just like supporting each other in a very human way. And I'll give you one example. We, like in the rugby club, we were given so little information that we had no idea who had come out of the tower and who hadn't come out of the tower. So one of our residents on the wall drew, I get a bit emotional talking about it, but he drew flat numbers of everyone in the tower, and we would mark on the wall whether we were safe or whether we weren't safe. And that was the only way that we had of knowing who was safe and who had got out of the tower. We were getting no information, no support. And it was because we were forced into situations like that that we knew and we saw very, very clearly that we needed to act for ourselves. And after that initial humanitarian, phase that lasted a few months, we then understood that our focus needed to be on much more practical issues, trying to sort out people's housing issues, our own housing issues, because everyone was living in hotels. So, making sure that children making sure that they had access to proper rooms where they could do their homework, and mental health provision, which was like a one standard fits all, which was totally inappropriate for the community. So working with the NHS to kind of like get them to change the way that they provided mental health services, working with the council to ensure that we were calling for the council to be taken into special measures. That never happened. But then the council to start changing. And I remember in the early days, like almost having to write the council's own letters to residents for them because they were so incapable of writing them themselves in the right, correct language. So we spent, I guess, like a year or so fully immersed in dealing with practicalities. So humanitarian practicalities. I think after a couple of years, we decided that our focus needed to move on very much onto the kind of justice, change and truth. And I think that's still where we're at now. Truth is really, for some people, truth doesn't really matter. And what really matters is criminal prosecutions. And for them, the public inquiry, which is where we will get a version of the truth, is irrelevant. For me, it's not irrelevant, because for me, it's really important that all the corporate core participants who came to the public inquiry, who didn't engage with the public inquiry, who engaged in a game of a carousel of finger pointing and blame spreading, are held to account. And I'm quite confident that when Sir Martin Moore-Bick's phase 2 report comes out, that is exactly what is going to happen. And I can count on the fingers of one hand, out of the 200 plus witnesses that came and gave evidence, the amount of people that came and actually treated that process with the respect that it needed and the respect that it deserved, because we lost 72 people, we lost our homes, these actors traumatized the community. And yet, if you'd been sitting through the public inquiry and listening to the evidence that was given, you would wonder how a fire could ever have broken out in Grenfell Tower, because nobody did anything wrong. And that's been really, really difficult to deal with. The fact that, after something so catastrophic happened, after 72 lives were lost, the perpetrators chose to carry on not taking responsibility. What I probably naively expected was that they would come and they would tell the truth, and that they'd be so shamed by their actions that they would use that opportunity to set the record straight. But that didn't happen. So we've got the public inquiry, the truth element. Then we have the justice element, which for most people is the most important thing, and that's about the perpetrators of the crime committed at Grenfell Tower are investigated by the Met Police, charged by the CPS, and end up in the dock facing justice and facing jail time where appropriate. And to date, nearly 7 years after Grenfell Tower, there hasn't been a single clink of handcuffs. We just found out from the Met Police today that they anticipate it's not going to be until 2026 when the earliest chance of prosecutions are going to be made. So that's nearly 10 years after Grenfell. And that is pretty unbearable. It's pretty hard to sit here and think that nearly 10 years after Grenfell and the loss of 72 lives, not a single person has been charged for that act. And then the last focus of Grenfell United has been on ensuring that there is change post-Grenfell. And we work very hard, as I stated earlier on, in trying to ensure that mental health services are more flexible to the needs of diverse communities. We work very hard on the social housing regulation bill to ensure that people who live in social housing are never treated the way that we were treated prior to the fire. And we've worked in a myriad of different areas, trying to ensure that we can create some kind of legacy that goes some way of honouring the lives that were lost in the fire.
In your view, Ed, why do you think your community, the Grenfell community, were treated like this before, immediately after, and in the years since the fire? Why have you been treated like this?
It's a shame that there were multiple calls by different QCs on behalf of the bereaved and survivors during the public inquiry for race and class, particularly race, to be examined. Sir Martin Moore-Bick chose not to do that, or chose not to engage with that request. So I definitely feel that was a missed opportunity by the public inquiry, because I think race and class are undoubtedly at the very root of what was going on. And we had a very patrician, a very white, very middle class council and full of white middle class council members who had no real connection with North Kensington. It was almost like an alien land to them. I mean, one example is we have a 20-year life expectancy difference between the north of the borough and the south of the borough. So I think that class and race played a really important part in the way that we were treated and the way that we weren't respected. But there was an added ingredient, and that added ingredient was the value of the land that we were living on. And I think a big motivation for the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea was, why should these poor non-white people live on land that we can't even afford to live on. And it was a gold mine, basically. They didn't have to dig for the gold. All they had to do was just marginalise and get rid of the communities that were living on those housing estates, a stone's throw away from millionaires' homes in Notting Hill Gate. And that was the long-term plan for our community. The long-term plan was to knock down Grenfell Tower, to knock down Lancaster West Estate, to knock down Silchester Estate, and to install new, it was called mixed community housing or mixed housing, but the focus was never on the existing communities. It would be on the communities coming in there. So you put together those three things. The kind of the trigger for it all was this: the cost of the land and the money that could be made through development, and then the kind of the race and the class issues that were behind that, of the people that were mainly living on that land. It's a shame that Sir Martin Morbick chose not to go down that route, because it would have been good to have had that in black and white, as a finding, and we're never going to get that now.
Are you a Londoner? Are you from London?
Yeah, I was born in Notting Hill Gate, so I was born literally a mile and a half away from Grenfell Tower, and I lived in Notting Hill Gate, Ladbroke Grove, my whole life, and as had the majority of people living in Grenfell Tower. They were born on the estate. It was such a close community anyway. But then, like during the refurbishment, we were so ill treated that we had no choice but to kind of come together as a community, and we got to know each other extremely well. I mean, I knew on a personal level, I probably knew, I don't know, 80% of the people that lived in the tower. And we held many, many meetings. We had, at our first meeting, we had 120 residents attend. People didn't like the way we were being treated, and these were our homes. We paid rent, and I remember one incident where there was a senior manager from Ryden who they took us into a show flat to show us how the new boiler was going to be positioned, and it was absolutely horrendous, with pipes coming through our front door, a big boiler by our front door. And we turned around and said to him, how would you like this if it was in your home? And he turned around to us and said, if I was getting it for nothing, I wouldn't mind. And, that was really hurtful, because we loved our homes. We loved our community. We weren't getting it for nothing. We paid our rent. You pay your rent for long enough, you pay for the cost of your flat. And that's how social housing works. And to be so disrespected, and that was kind of like, if you could think about that, if you're getting it for nothing, you should be happy. And that was how they treated us. And when we came to them with legitimate complaints, they were looking down their noses at us, just thinking, you're getting all this for nothing, shut up. That was their attitude towards us. From the building company, through to our landlord, through to the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, that was the way we were treated.
And while you've been doing all of this, like even immediately after the fire, what about like your jobs? Were you having to go back to work straight away, as well as learn to campaign and to seek justice? Like, how was that? How did that look?
So, you know what? It's been such an individual journey for so many different people. There are some people, I mean, about 2 days after the fire, I was walking down Kensington High Street, and I saw my direct neighbour from my landing, who'd managed to get out safely. And she was standing outside the Royal Garden Hotel bus stop. She was going to work. I mean, there was one school, one of the pupils attending the local school had her exams that next morning, and she went and took her O-levels or her GCSEs that next morning. Some people have never got back to work. Some people have had to get back to work because they needed to, feed the family. And so I think every single person has gone on their own individual journey with that. But most of the committee at GU, and we don't get paid for being committee members, are mixing jobs, family, children, work with being a GU committee member. And yeah, it's a commitment, but we have a reason to be committed. And we set out in the days when Grenfell United was founded, that we would honour the memory of those that passed away, that we would try and keep our community together, and that we would fight for justice. And we are a long, long way away from any type of meaningful justice. And until that happens, we will continue fighting.
This System Change podcast is only possible because of the support of Triodos Bank UK, an ethical and sustainable bank that has been in the game for over 40 years, long before shareholder action and campaigning for banks and institutions to divest from companies that put profit before people and planet. The impact investment funds offered by Triodos are actively managed so that companies are taken in or out of their portfolios depending on performance, reputational issues, or just how these companies are affecting society or the environment. Triodos Investment Management divested a few years ago from a company found to be at least partly responsible for the tragic Grenfell fire following the first phase of the public inquiry. This is just one of the many reasons why I am truly proud to have Triodos as the exclusive sponsors of If I Ruled the World. If you ruled the world, Ed, what would you do? What would you do straight away if you were in office? What would you ban? What would you outlaw?
Do you know, the thing that strikes me most when I think about that is I literally in the days after the fire, standing under like that carcass of Grenfell Tower, I was convinced that this absolute tragedy would act as a catalyst for change. Again, I was naive enough to believe it would act as a catalyst for societal change. I couldn't see it any other way, with so many fatalities, so much destruction. And then the last 7 years have taught me that so little has changed, and it's been so difficult to instigate that change. For me, at the heart of it all is we can't live in a system that puts profit above the health and safety of human lives, because that essentially is what happened at Grenfell. The desire of different companies to make money, the thoughtlessness of the actors inside those companies in making their companies money far superseded the value of our human lives. The consequence of that is that 72 people perished in the most absolutely horrific circumstances. So if I ruled the world and I had a magic wand, I would wave it and I would ensure that, I mean, it's a cultural thing. So it's not even that you can do it with legislation or you can do it with statute. It's to change the way that people think about the value of human lives versus the power and greed of money. And for me, that would be the one thing that would have prevented Grenfell happening in the first place. Needs to happen right now, because even within some of the companies that were involved with Grenfell, I don't think that they've changed the way that they operate. I think that human lives are less important than their need to continue selling the products that they sell. So if those very actors haven't changed the way they behave, you almost want to give up on kind of a wider societal change. And then the other thing that I think I would try and change is I'd try and get us some politicians that are fit for purpose, because without being party political, we have spent 7 years facing a wall of basic incompetence and indifference inside Westminster. And I think very hard about how we approached trying to instigate change, and we did it in a way where we didn't want to take our anger and upset to those that most deserve it. So we always acted in a very cogent, rational, and I dare say respectful way to the politicians, in the hope that that would act as a catalyst to get them to do the change that they needed. But they didn't, and they have failed. When I walk past Parliament, and I'm in Westminster, I look at Parliament and I feel a sense of anger, because I feel a sense of fraud. I feel that the people who are inside that building are defrauding the country. They're defrauding the country because they're meant to be doing one thing. And, I've always understood that government's first duty is to keep the people safe. And they failed to do that prior to Grenfell. And despite Grenfell happening, they have failed to do that. They don't have politicians and individuals inside Parliament who can identify that there is a problem and start at A, find a pathway to a solution, which is B, and then arrive at C, which is to carry out those actions that lead to change. And that's why 7 years after Grenfell, we're talking, but we're talking against a backdrop of so little change. You know, buildings up and down the country with dangerous cladding on, thousands and thousands of individuals trapped in the cladding scandal, unable to sell their properties, disabled people living in high-rise buildings with no emergency evacuation plan. And it's really frustrating. It's really upsetting that something so terrible could happen, and yet it hasn't acted as a catalyst for the change that needs to come. And, you know, I hope we're never, ever talking about another Grenfell and that having to be the catalyst, because that would just be just too awful to consider.
I can hear the frustration. And actually, I'm amazed that you can speak so, you know, in such a measured way, because I can really feel that. And as ruler of the world, you know, there would be, I guess you'd have the ability to tackle wider issues as well. And if you had control of the global tax pot, how would you spend that?
Well, I wouldn't have spent very much on it, but I'd ensure that these criminal prosecutions that we've been waiting for happened a lot quicker than they have. And I know that the Met Police have put a lot of resource and a lot of, you know, I'm going to say man hours, but, you know, like a lot of police hours into Grenfell. But we've just heard today that, you know, we're going to have to wait another couple of years before any prosecutions come. And that is really, really difficult to try and get one's head around. I mean, it's just unbearable that we have to wait near on 10 years before prosecutions can happen. And I'm thinking of a year after Grenfell in Genoa in Italy, there was a bridge collapsed. And I was reading like a couple of years ago that the prosecutions have already taken place over there. So Italy, that isn't renowned for the speed of its judicial system, can get its act together. I'm like baffled by the fact that we're still waiting so long for our Met Police to actually act. You know, globally, I think, you know, it is quite the pertinence around this issue around ACM cladding is the global issue. And, you know, there are countries in the world that are riddled with exactly the same cladding as Grenfell. So I guess if I had a world wish, it would be that all of those buildings are remediated and that there isn't a single person anywhere in the world at any time going to sleep in a building that is as dangerous or was as dangerous as Grenfell was.
You know, there's an interesting thing as well. I guess if you were in that position where you take office as ruler of the world, you could nominate a successor, you know, when you reach the end of your tenure. But I'm actually curious about who would you fire, you know, when you get going, but then who would you nominate when you retire?
Do you know what? I've got like a long list of people, of the populists around at the moment that I'd be very happy to get rid of from all these different countries, and one potentially returning in not too long a time. And I know it sounds really daft, but, you know, we've got some amazing, amazing young people that lived in Grenfell Tower, and I'll probably nominate one of them. And they certainly wouldn't let anyone down. They'd be a lot better than the present mob we've got.
Ed, you know, how do you find peace? Like, what are the things that you've now been able to, as you say, fit around this trauma, this grief? It's raw, you know, that's plain to see. But, you know, how have you managed to find peace in all of this?
So on a very personal level, I mean, I've had a lot of counselling, and I'm very grateful for that because it's there for me to access, and I don't use it all the time now, but I have had access to it. And my trauma comes out in various ways. I've gone through different stages of. At present, my trauma comes out in my inability to settle into my new property where I'm living, my new flat. And I've been here 2.5 years and I still haven't got any lampshades or proper furniture. And I really need to address that because it's really getting me down. But it's a symptom of what happened. But like I explained earlier on, like any kind of like bereavement, you know, I don't think that the loss and the bereavement are not going to go away. The trauma of Grenfell isn't going to disappear. But I've been lucky enough in my own life. I love bird watching. I love nature. So I go out to my local park. I take my binoculars. I know where the local birds are. I know where the little, and this is in Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park. I know where the little owls are. I know when any unusual species come into the park. I absolutely love doing that. And that's a great therapy. I've taken up playing golf. I've never done anything quite as frivolous in my whole life and got so much pleasure from it. But it's these little things that kind of come and surround the trauma and act as a buffer. And, you know, I've got great friends. We've got a great community. I love traveling. As time goes by, and as I said to you before, like I said, I've never been in a better place. That sounds a little bit. It's not quite putting the finger on where I am at, because I think even in the conversation we've had today, I'm still, as many people are, extremely traumatized by what happened. I'm still extremely upset, dissatisfied, angry about the lack of change, the fact that there haven't been any prosecutions. But I don't want to become just like another victim. And like around the 6-year anniversary, I got this understanding that I don't want my whole life, what I've got left of it, defined by Grenfell, because my life wasn't defined by Grenfell prior to Grenfell. And then I don't, I'll never leave, and I'll never abandon what needs to be done. But I need to put in some other stuff around in my life. And in fact, quite recently, I went to see the play, the National Theatre play about Grenfell. And it had such a profound effect in a kind of like negative way on me. I attended the testimony week a little while ago, a couple of days of that. And it's kind of like being taken back to those kind of really, really traumatic events. It's not a great thing for me to be doing with my time, but I kind of look at that as a positive. For me, there's a value in us having this conversation, and the value is that people will listen to this conversation, and a bit like Steve McQueen's art installation, or the play at the National Theatre, or a documentary on television, or a docudrama, whatever it is, we're now in the 7th year since the fire. There are going to be very few significant moments. We're going to have the publication of the phase 2 report. We're going to have criminal prosecutions, and then we're going to, before too long, come to the 10th year anniversary. Now, outside of those significant moments, we need to keep Grenfell alive, and we need to keep Grenfell alive in people's public consciousness, because so little has changed. So I'm delighted to talk to you. I'm delighted to talk to the podcast, and I hope that people will listen to this and understand that Grenfell isn't done and dusted. Grenfell isn't sorted. Grenfell it's not something that happened 7 years ago and everything's all right now. Grenfell happened 7 years ago and very little has changed and very little is all right.
At the time of recording this episode, the most recent data released from the UK government's Department for Levelling Up, Housing and Communities, of the 4,336 high residential buildings, 11 metres and over in height, identified with unsafe cladding, 999 have completed remediation work, which is just under a quarter at 23%. So perhaps the government would argue that there has been some change, but clearly not enough and not fast enough, particularly when fires continue to be a risk. In the UK, just this January, a cladding fire at a block of flats in northwest London prompted the Fire Brigades Union to issue a warning of government and corporate criminal complacency, saying that they'd been warning about cladding fire risks many years before Grenfell. No one was hurt in the Wembley fire, but the outcome in Spain in Valencia this April was sadly not the same. The 14-story, this time luxury apartment block was engulfed in flames within 15 minutes and 10 people lost their lives in the blaze. The UAE, another place where there seems to be a real spike in these fires since this ACM cladding was introduced, have recorded 18 high-rise cladding fires in just 13 years. Profit over people's lives, folks. I don't know what more to say than that, other than thank you to my sponsors, Triodos, for making this episode possible. A huge thank you to the Grenfell United team for setting up the interview. Kareem, I'm sorry you couldn't make it. I hope your family are well. And a huge thank you to Ed for revisiting the Grenfell tragedy so that he can help keep the fight for justice alive in our minds. I'd love to one day follow up with an interview with Ed somewhere outdoors for a spot of birding, talk about Ed without the trauma of Grenfell. I normally do the whole follow, like the podcast spiel, ask for your comments, questions, thoughts, which of course you can still send to podcast@gillianburtvoice.com or find me on Instagram. But I think my one big ask from you today is please keep Grenfell in your hearts, support Grenfell United, the survivors and bereaved fighting so that we can all be safe in our homes and so that they finally get justice for their loved ones. Thanks for listening.